The history of the Jewish presence in the Bohemian heartland finds its earliest documented evidence in the 10th century, a period defined by the consolidation of the Przemyslid dynasty and the emergence of Prague as a central node in the trans-European trade network. In the year 965, Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, a Sephardic Jewish merchant and diplomat from Tortosa, serving the Caliphate of Cordoba, arrived in the Vltava Valley and recorded the first detailed description of the city. His primary accounts describe a thriving marketplace constructed of stone and lime, where Jewish traders from various regions across the Islamic world and Byzantium gathered to exchange goods. These early merchants operated primarily under the protection of the ruling dukes, establishing themselves in strategic proximity to the administrative centers of Vyšehrad and Prague Castle. The 10th and 11th centuries witnessed the transition of these transient merchant groups into permanent communal entities, as they began to acquire land for the construction of stone residences and the establishment of the first religious institutions. Historical records from the reign of Vladislaus II indicate that Jewish financiers provided crucial capital for the expansion of royal infrastructure, including the fortification of the castle precincts. This symbiotic relationship between the crown and the community was predicated on the Jewish monopoly over complex financial instruments and long-distance commercial intelligence, which the early Bohemian state lacked. The social organization of these nascent communities mirrored the structures of other Ashkenazi centers in the Rhineland, with a strong emphasis on self-governance through a council of elders and religious scholars. By the late 11th century, the focus of Jewish life gradually shifted toward the right bank of the Vltava, centering on the area that would eventually coalesce into the Jewish quarter. This relocation was driven by the shifting centers of political power and the increasing importance of the Old Town Market. During the First Crusade in 1096, the community faced its first major existential challenge, as passing Crusader armies instigated violent persecutions, forcing many to seek refuge within the fortified walls of Vyšehrad. This period concludes with the stabilization of the community's legal identity, setting the stage for the more formalized royal protections of the 13th century. But why did it all end with the expulsion of all Jews, and did they actually deserve it? The middle of the 13th century marked a fundamental reorganization of the legal and social framework governing Jewish life in the Kingdom of Bohemia, precipitated by the administrative reforms of King Przemysl Ottokar II. In 1254, the sovereign issued the Statuta Judiorum, a comprehensive legal code modeled after the Austrian Privilege of 1244, which definitively established the doctrine of Camerae Regis Servuli, or servants of the royal chamber. This revolutionary classification removed the Jewish population from the jurisdiction of local municipal and ecclesiastical courts, placing them under the direct protection and exclusive authority of the crown. By designating the community as royal property, the monarch secured a consistent source of liquid capital through specialized taxation systems that functioned independently of the feudal agrarian tithes. The charter stipulated that any physical injury or property damage inflicted upon a Jewish subject was considered an affront to the royal person, punishable by severe fines that flowed directly into the state treasury. This legal codification provided a sophisticated mechanism for resolving intercommunal disputes, mandating that litigations between Christians and Jews be heard before a royal judge or the king himself, rather than local church tribunals. The statutes also explicitly protected Jewish cemeteries and synagogues from desecration, recognizing these spaces as essential components of the royal infrastructure. In 1262, the king further expanded these privileges by confirming the community's right to internal judicial autonomy, allowing rabbinical courts to adjudicate matters of civil and religious law among their own members. The taxation of the Jewish community under the Statuta Judiorum was implemented through a poll tax and various indirect levies on commercial transactions, which provided the Przemyslid dynasty with the financial resources necessary to maintain a professional military and expand royal influence in Central Europe. Unlike the landed aristocracy, whose wealth was tied to hereditary estates and agricultural cycles, the Jewish community provided the crown with mobile capital that could be deployed rapidly during political crises or for large-scale building projects. This financial symbiosis was reinforced by the prohibition of usury among Christians by the Catholic Church, leaving a vacuum in the credit market that Jewish financiers were legally permitted to fill under royal license. The 1354 charter served as the primary legal precedent for subsequent Bohemian rulers, ensuring a continuity of status that shielded the community from the rising influence of the independent city councils of Prague. These councils frequently viewed the Jewish community as an economic threat to their monopolistic guild structures, yet the royal prerogative established by Ottokar II effectively blocked municipal attempts to impose local taxes or restrictions on Jewish trade. The period defined by the Statuta Judiorum thus transformed the Jewish population from a group of protected foreign merchants into an integral, formally recognized estate within the Bohemian Kingdom. This era of legal stabilization culminated in the physical expansion of the Jewish quarter, later known as Josefov. This urban development was centered within the low-lying marshlands of the Vltava's right bank, a location necessitated by medieval zoning restrictions that prohibited Jewish expansion into the primary residential districts of the Old Town. The architectural centerpiece of this district is the Old New Synagogue, or Staronova Synagoga, completed around 1270. As the oldest active synagogue in Europe, its construction represents a significant transition in communal engineering, utilizing early Cistercian Burgundian Gothic forms, adapted for the specific liturgical requirements of a Jewish house of worship. Unlike the single-nave structures typical of the period, the Old New Synagogue features a unique double-nave layout, with two massive octagonal pillars supporting 6 bays of 5-ribbed vaulting. This specific vaulting configuration was a deliberate departure from the 4-ribbed or cross-vaulting systems found in contemporary Christian cathedrals, possibly intended to distinguish the building's religious identity from the dominant Gothic ecclesiastical style. The exterior of the synagogue is defined by high brick gables and heavy stone buttresses, which were essential for providing structural integrity against the periodic flooding of the Vltava River. The interior floor is positioned significantly below the street level, a design feature that complied with medieval regulations mandating that non-Christian houses of worship not exceed the height of local churches, while also symbolically referencing the biblical plea to call upon the divine out of the depths. The central focus of the interior space is the Almamor, or Bima, a raised platform from which the Torah is read, enclosed by a late Gothic iron grille. This liturgical arrangement necessitated the double-nave plan to ensure unobstructed lines of sight for the congregants, while accommodating the central pillars. Surrounding the main prayer hall are annexes that were added in the 14th and 15th centuries, including a separate vestibule and a dedicated women's gallery that connected to the main hall through narrow horizontal slits in the thick stone walls. During the 14th century, the district saw the addition of the High Synagogue and the Pinkas Synagogue, the latter of which was constructed as a private house of prayer for the prominent Horowitz family. The communal infrastructure also included a bathhouse, or mikveh, a town hall for administrative functions, and the Old Jewish Cemetery, which began operation in the early 15th century. The cemetery's unique multi-layered burial system was in direct architectural response to the legal prohibition against expanding the ghetto's perimeter, resulting in a dense vertical accumulation of gravestones that became a permanent landmark of the district. The economic trajectory of the Bohemian Kingdom during the 14th century was inextricably linked to the fiscal management and metallurgical expertise found within the Jewish community, particularly under the reign of John of Luxembourg and later Charles IV. While the agrarian economy remained the province of the feudal estates, the Jewish population developed a high degree of specialization in the processing of precious metals and the administration of liquid assets. This expertise was centered in the royal mint, where Jewish master assayers and financiers were instrumental in the transition from the diverse local coinages of the early Middle Ages to the standardized Prague groschen. The Prague groschen, backed by the silver mines of Kutná Hora, became one of the most stable currencies in Central Europe, and its successful implementation required a sophisticated understanding of silver purity and exchange ratios that Jewish experts provided to the royal court. Under the Luxembourg dynasty, the management of the royal treasury involved the extensive use of Jewish chamber servants as factors and fiscal agents who facilitated the movement of capital across international borders. These individuals utilized advanced ledger-keeping techniques and bills of exchange that bypassed the physical transport of bullion, thereby reducing the risks of banditry and fluctuating metal values. The proficiency of Jewish merchants in the wholesale distribution of salt, a royal monopoly of critical importance, further integrated the community into the state's revenue-generating apparatus. Jewish agents managed the complex logistics of salt transport from the mines of the Salzkammergut to the distribution hubs in Prague, ensuring a consistent influx of duties to the crown. The financial involvement of the community extended into the burgeoning market of maritime and terrestrial insurance, where Jewish syndicates provided the necessary risk mitigation for the long-distance spice and silk trades. By providing letters of credit and managing high-volume currency exchanges, these financiers enabled the Bohemian court to fund large-scale diplomatic missions and the construction of the new town of Prague, without depleting the physical reserves of the treasury. This period also saw the emergence of Jewish pawnbroking and credit institutions that operated under specific royal licenses, providing the urban middle class and the lower nobility with the liquidity required for commercial expansion and the fulfillment of feudal obligations. The expertise of the Jewish community in precious stones and jewelry also played a vital role in the cultural prestige of the Luxembourg court. Jewish goldsmiths and gem cutters were frequently commissioned to produce ceremonial objects and diplomatic gifts that utilized refined techniques in filigree and cloisonné. These artisans operated in specialized workshops that were exempt from the restrictive regulations of the Christian guilds, allowing for greater artistic innovation and the adoption of technical improvements from the Mediterranean world. The management of the royal regalia and the procurement of exotic pigments for illuminated manuscripts were often entrusted to Jewish intermediaries who maintained connections with suppliers in the Levant. This economic specialization created a resilient financial infrastructure that supported the Bohemian state's centralizing ambitions, ensuring that the crown remained the primary beneficiary of Jewish commercial intelligence and fiscal proficiency throughout the High Middle Ages. The reign of Charles IV, spanning the mid-14th century, represented a period of unprecedented institutional integration for the Jewish community within the broader political theology of the Holy Roman Empire. Charles, functioning as both the King of Bohemia and the Holy Roman Emperor, envisioned Prague as the definitive ideological successor to Rome and Constantinople, a new Rome, that required a highly organized and legally secure urban population. Within this imperial blueprint, the Jewish community was positioned as a critical demographic pillar, valued for its ability to bridge the gap between local commerce and the transcontinental networks of the Mediterranean and the Levant. The emperor's policy of renovatio imperii necessitated a departure from the ad hoc protections of his predecessors, leading to the formal confirmation of Jewish privileges in 1348, which reinforced the legal barriers protecting the ghetto from the increasing administrative encroachment of the Old Town municipal councils. The expansion of Prague through the founding of the new town, or Nové Město, provided the Jewish community with expanded commercial opportunities, as Charles deliberately integrated the Jewish quarter into the city's new defensive perimeter. This era saw the official recognition of the Jewish community as a distinct legal estate with its own representative body, the Jewish elders, who were granted the authority to oversee internal tax allocation and represent the ghetto's interests before the royal chancery. The emperor's pragmatic approach to religious minorities was exemplified by his personal intervention in 1350 to prevent the expulsion of Jews from various Bohemian towns, arguing that such actions constituted a direct violation of the royal prerogative and caused irreparable harm to the imperial treasury. This protection was codified in the Golden Bull of 1356, which, while focusing on the election of the emperor, solidified the principle that the taxation of Jews was an inalienable right of the secular electors. Despite this imperial patronage, the mid-14th century was characterized by a widening discrepancy between the emperor's legal protections and the social realities of the Bohemian populace. The foundation of Charles University in 1348 introduced a new intellectual class to Prague, which, while promoting humanism, also reinforced traditional scholastic arguments regarding the social limitations of non-Christian populations. The emperor's reliance on Jewish financiers to fund the construction of the Charles Bridge and the St. Vitus Cathedral created latent resentment among the urban guilds, who viewed the community's exempt status as an unfair competitive advantage. These economic grievances were often sublimated into religious anxieties, particularly as the flagellant movements and the initial rumors of the Black Death began to percolate across Central Europe toward the end of the 1340s. Charles IV's response to these localized tensions was consistently characterized by fiscal pragmatism. In 1349, he granted the city of Frankfurt the right to the property of any Jews killed during potential riots, a move that revealed the fragile limits of imperial protection when weighed against political stability. However, within Prague itself, the emperor maintained a strict enforcement of the king's peace, viewing any disruption of the Jewish quarter as a threat to his vision of imperial order. The period concluded with the physical and cultural flourishing of the ghetto, as the community benefited from the relative stability of the imperial court, setting a precedent for the court Jews who would eventually navigate the complexities of Habsburg administration in the centuries to follow. This era thus established a dual legacy of high-level political inclusion and simmering grassroots opposition that would define the centuries leading up to the events of 1541. The demographic stability established during the High Medieval period was fundamentally disrupted in the mid-14th century by the arrival of the Yersinia pestis bacterium, which reached the Bohemian Basin around 1350. While Prague avoided the total demographic collapse seen in the Mediterranean and the Rhineland, the localized outbreaks of the Black Death catalyzed a profound transformation in the social psychology and municipal administration of the city. The arrival of the pandemic coincided with a period of crop failures and environmental stress, which had already weakened the urban poor and intensified the competition for dwindling resources between the Old Town and the Jewish quarter. Epidemiological records from the period suggest that the ghetto's specific sanitation practices, including the ritual washing mandated by halakhic law and the relatively isolated water supply from deep wells, resulted in a marginally lower initial mortality rate compared to the densely packed Christian parishes. This statistical anomaly, rather than being viewed as a result of hygiene, was misinterpreted by contemporary observers as evidence of malevolent intervention or divine disfavor. The resulting social anxieties were fueled by the spread of the well poisoning myth, a dangerous conspiracy theory that alleged Jewish agents were deliberately contaminating municipal water sources to undermine the Christian population. These accusations were disseminated by itinerant preachers and radicalized members of the urban guilds, who utilized the atmosphere of medical uncertainty to challenge the royal protections afforded to the Jewish community. In 1349 and 1350, localized instances of violence occurred in the outskirts of Prague, where the breakdown of the king's peace allowed for the extrajudicial seizure of Jewish assets under the pretext of plague prevention. These events marked a critical transition in the relationship between the Jewish town and the municipal government, as the Old Town Council began to argue that the presence of the ghetto constituted a public health risk that superseded traditional royal charters. The institutional response to the pandemic included the establishment of the first permanent quarantine protocols and the expansion of municipal burial grounds, such as the Pestilence Cemetery in the new town. However, the Jewish community was systematically excluded from these civic health initiatives, forced instead to rely on internal charitable organizations, or Hevra Kadisha, to manage the logistical burden of the deceased within the confined space of the old Jewish cemetery. The psychological strain of the period was further exacerbated by the flagellant movement, groups of radical penitents who processed through the streets of Prague, inciting anti-Jewish fervor as a means of collective atonement. Charles IV, recognizing the threat these movements posed to imperial order, eventually prohibited the flagellants from entering the city. Yet, the underlying xenophobia remained embedded in the urban consciousness. The long-term consequence of the Black Death era was the erosion of the Golden Age consensus, as the community was increasingly viewed through the lens of suspicion rather than economic utility. The fiscal burden of the plague also led to the imposition of extraordinary corpse taxes on the Jewish community, further straining the financial relationship with the crown. By the 1360s, the legal status of the Jewish population had shifted from that of integrated royal servants to a marginalized group whose safety was contingent upon the immediate political stability of the court. This period of epidemiological crisis and social fragmentation established the ideological groundwork for the subsequent religious upheavals of the 15th century, ensuring that any future societal stressor would be inextricably linked to the perceived status of the Jewish quarter. The late 14th century in the Kingdom of Bohemia was defined by a period of acute political volatility under the reign of Wenceslaus IV, whose frequent absences from Prague created an administrative vacuum that local municipal and ecclesiastical powers sought to exploit. On Easter Sunday, April the 18th, 1389, this instability culminated in the most devastating instance of communal violence in the history of medieval Prague. The immediate pretext for the incursion into the Jewish quarter was an accusation of sacrilegium, specifically that a Jewish individual had desecrated the Eucharist during a clerical procession. While the king's peace technically remained in effect, the temporary departure of the monarch to his hunting seat at Krivoklat left the Jewish community without its primary legal protector, allowing the vicarious of the Prague Archbishopric to mobilize the urban populace against the ghetto. The ensuing assault resulted in the systematic liquidation of nearly 3,000 individuals, representing a significant portion of the district's population. Unlike the sporadic riots of the mid-century, the 1389 pogrom was characterized by the organized destruction of communal infrastructure, including the ransacking of the rabbinical library and the partial demolition of private masonry residences. Historical accounts, most notably the Selihat or liturgical lamentations, composed by the contemporary witness Rabbi Avigdor Kara, record that the violence was not limited to physical injury, but extended to the forced conversion of survivors and the widespread confiscation of movable assets. The Old New Synagogue was the site of a mass casualty event where residents sought sanctuary, leaving physical traces on the interior walls that remained visible for centuries as a testament to the breach of the royal safeguards established by the Presham Islids. The administrative reaction to the massacre was defined by fiscal opportunism rather than judicial restitution. Wenceslaus IV, upon his return to the capital, did not prosecute the leaders of the Old Town Municipal Council or the clergy who had incited the mob. Instead, the royal chancery interpreted the event as a loss of royal property, as the Jewish community functioned legally as the king's chamber servants. Consequently, the king imposed a massive collective fine on the Christian city of Prague, effectively converting the tragedy into a significant influx of capital for the royal treasury. This move reinforced the mercenary nature of the crown's protection, demonstrating that the safety of the Jewish population was contingent upon their financial value to the state. The 1389 pogrom also led to a significant restructuring of the ghetto's internal demographics, as many survivors emigrated to the relative safety of Poland or the Ottoman-controlled territories in the south. For those who remained, the event led to the strengthening of communal defensive measures, including the reinforcement of the gates separating the Jewish town from the Christian parishes of St. Gall and St. Nicholas. The tombstone of Avigdor Kara, which survives as the oldest identifiable monument in the Old Jewish Cemetery, serves as the primary epigraphic record of this era, marking the end of the relative security enjoyed during the Luxembourg Golden Age. This period of violence ensured that the communal identity of Prague's Jews would henceforth be defined by a heightened sense of legal precariousness and an increased reliance on the personal whims of the Habsburg and Jagiellonian successors. The 15th century inaugurated a period of systemic religious and political fragmentation within the Bohemian Crown lands, triggered by the 1415 execution of the reformer John Huss at the Council of Constance. This era, characterized by the Hussite Wars, fundamentally altered the traditional relationship between the monarch, the Catholic Church, and the Jewish quarter. As the Hussite revolutionaries, particularly the radical Taborite and moderate Utrechtist factions, challenged the legitimacy of the Catholic hierarchy, The Jewish population found itself in a precarious state of double taxation and shifting allegiances. While the community had historically relied upon the protection of the Luxembourg dynasty, the overt hostility between King Sigismund and the Hussite forces meant that the ghetto was often viewed with suspicion by the urban reformers, who equated royal financial assets with the very foundations of the monarch's military power. In 1420, during the initial crusades against the Hussites, radical elements within the Prague municipal militias targeted the Jewish district under the pretext of eliminating potential royalist informants. The ensuing disturbances in 1421 led to the localized seizure of property and the forced relocation of several families, as the traditional legal safeguards were temporarily suspended by the revolutionary city administration. However, the Hussite movement's intense focus on Old Testament biblicism, referred to as the Law of God or Lex Dei, created a complex ideological paradox. While the radical Taborites engaged in iconoclastic violence, the moderate Utrechists frequently sought to maintain the Jewish presence as a living testament to the biblical foundations of their own reformist theology. This provided a slim margin of ideological safety that prevented the total liquidation of the Prague community during the height of the Civil War. Economic survival during this period necessitated a transition from high-level royal finance to localized municipal pragmatism. With the suspension of international trade routes through the Vltava Valley, Jewish merchants adapted by providing essential supplies, such as grain, livestock, and worked leather, to the Hussite armies. The Prague Old Town Council, now under reformist control, imposed extraordinary defense levies on the Jewish quarter to fund the fortification of the city walls and the maintenance of the field armies led by Jan Žižka. This transition from being exclusive servants of the crown to becoming municipal taxpayers marked a significant erosion of the king's exclusive jurisdiction as local magistrates began to assert administrative authority over the ghetto's internal affairs. The 1436 Jalava Compacts, which formally ended the primary phase of the conflict, restored King Sigismund to the Bohemian throne, but failed to fully reinstate the pre-war legal status of the Jewish community. The wars had permanently empowered the Bohemian estates and the municipal governments of Prague, who now demanded a greater share of Jewish tax revenues that had previously flowed into the royal treasury. Consequently, the mid-15th century was defined by a polycentric power structure where the community had to negotiate its survival with a fragmented landscape of noble factions and reformist city leaders. The institutional resilience demonstrated during these decades of civil strife enabled the Jewish quarter to preserve its communal continuity, yet the experience of being positioned between warring Christian dogmas ensured that the population remained acutely sensitive to the religious shifts that would eventually define the 16th century Habsburg administration. The late 15th century in the Kingdom of Bohemia was defined by a profound shift in the center of political gravity, inaugurated by the 1471 election of Vladislaus II Jagiello. This period represented a departure from the centralized imperial authority of the Luxembourgs, as the Jagiellonian monarchs faced a sophisticated and increasingly assertive assembly of the Bohemian estates, known as the Diet. The central theme of this era was the erosion of royal absolutism, characterized by a series of legal compromises where the crown's traditional prerogatives, including the exclusive protection of the Jewish population, were systematically challenged by the high nobility and the burghers of the royal towns. The 1485 Peace of Kutná-Hora established a lasting religious settlement between Catholics and Utrechists. Yet it also solidified the power of the nobility to dictate terms to a monarch whose financial and military dependency on the estates reached unprecedented levels. In the year 1500, the enactment of the Vladislav Land Ordinance, or Vladislavské Zřízení zemské, marked a critical legislative milestone in the marginalization of royal authority. This codification of Bohemian law conspicuously omitted many of the 13th century royal protections afforded to the Jewish community, instead granting the estates significant control over the movement and taxation of non-Christian residents. The high nobility began to exploit this legal ambiguity by inviting Jewish families to settle on their private seigneurial domains, effectively creating a network of noble Jews who operated outside the traditional jurisdiction of the royal chamber. This created a dual system of residency that provoked intense friction between the landed aristocracy and the municipal councils of Prague, as the latter viewed these private settlements as a strategy to bypass urban tolls and market regulations. The municipal councils of the old and new towns of Prague utilized the sessions of the Diet to advocate for the St. James's Day decrees, which sought to impose restrictive residency permits and limit Jewish commercial activities to specific commodities. Under the Jagiellonian administration, the monarch was often characterized by the epithet Rex Bene, reflecting a tendency to concede to the demands of the estates to ensure political survival, thereby weakening the institutional shield of the Statuta Judiorum. The 1517 Treaty of St. Wenceslas provided a temporary cessation of the conflict between the towns and the nobility regarding market rights, but it left the Jewish community in a state of legal precariousness, as the treaty failed to definitively resolve whether the community remained a royal asset or a municipal ward. During the subsequent reign of Louis Jagiello, which commenced in 1516, the financial infrastructure of the crown became almost entirely reliant on the extraordinary taxes approved by the Diet. This fiscal dependency stripped the monarch of the ability to veto the increasingly xenophobic petitions presented by the Prague guilds, who argued that Jewish competition in the craft and money-lending sectors was the primary cause of urban economic stagnation. The Jagiellonian era thus transformed the Jewish town from a protected royal enclave into a contested political territory, where the ancient rights of the servants of the chamber were steadily eroded by the burgeoning legislative power of the Bohemian Diet. This period of administrative decentralization established the structural resentments and legal precedents that the Habsburgs would inherit, directly contributing to the heightened political volatility that defined the years leading up to 1541. The economic friction defining the early 16th century in Prague was primarily localized within the overlapping markets of the Christian guilds and the burgeoning artisan class of the Jewish quarter. This era witnessed a significant transition in the ghetto's internal economy, as the community shifted from purely financial services to the direct production and distribution of manufactured goods, particularly within the leather and textile sectors. The Christian guilds, or Seki, of the Old Town, operated under a monopolistic framework that strictly regulated the quality, quantity, and price of all urban crafts, yet these regulations were frequently challenged by Jewish artisans who functioned outside the guild hierarchy. The resulting rivalry was not merely a matter of religious difference, but a systemic conflict over market access, raw material procurement, and the definition of retail rights within the city's defensive walls. In the leather industry, the competition was centered on the distinction between the vegetable tanning processes used by Christian tanners and the alum tanning techniques, or white tanning, practiced by Jewish jurchery. Jewish leather workers specialized in the production of soft leathers used for gloves, pouches, and luxury book bindings, commodities that were in high demand among the humanist circles of the royal court. The Old Town guilds attempted to restrict Jewish access to the raw hides of the municipal slaughterhouses, leading to frequent litigations before the royal burgrave regarding the right of preemption. To circumvent these restrictions, Jewish merchants established independent supply lines with rural estates, often purchasing hides directly from the nobility, which further incensed the urban guilds, who viewed this as a subversion of traditional market laws. The textile trade provided an even more complex arena for internecine rivalry, specifically regarding the fustian or barchet market and the processing of raw wool. While Christian weavers held the exclusive right to operate looms within the Old Town, Jewish merchants dominated the transit trade of raw fibers and the secondary market for finished garments. The second-hand trade, known in Prague as veteshnictví, was a Jewish specialty that provided the urban poor and lower nobility with affordable clothing, yet the Christian Tailors Guild argued that the repair and resale of used textiles constituted an infringement on their monopoly to produce new apparel. By the 1530s, these grievances had evolved into a series of municipal ordinances that prohibited Jewish traders from displaying their wares on the public squares of the Old Town, instead forcing them to conduct retail operations through the back door of the ghetto. or at designated periodic fairs. This urban rivalry was further complicated by the Jewish community's proficiency in the silk and embroidery trades, which required specialized looms and dyes imported from the Mediterranean. Because these luxury items were not covered by the ancient charters of the local guilds, Jewish silk workers occupied a unique niche that the municipal authorities struggled to regulate. The Old Town Council responded by imposing gate tolls on raw silk and linen entering the Jewish quarter, an economic tactic designed to artificially inflate the production costs of Jewish-made goods. These trade wars were frequently debated in the sessions of the Bohemian Diet, where the burghers of the Old Town demanded the strict separation of markets, while Jewish representatives argued for the freedom of the trade based on their status as royal servants. The escalating economic tension within the leather and textile sectors provided the structural foundation for the political petitions of the 1530s, ensuring that the eventual drive for expulsion was rooted in the pragmatic concerns of urban market dominance and the erosion of guild monopolies. In the year 1516, the Prague Jewish quarter experienced a catastrophic conflagration that decimated a significant portion of its residential and communal infrastructure, occurring during the administrative transition of the Jagiellonian period. This fire originated in the densely packed northern sector of the district and, fueled by the prevailing timber construction of the secondary dwellings, quickly bypassed the stone-built defensive perimeters. The destruction necessitated a comprehensive urban reconstruction program that showcased the sophisticated internal self-governance of the community through the Vaad, or communal board, which successfully coordinated the allocation of emergency funds and building materials without initial royal or municipal subsidies. This period of rebuilding was characterized by the formalization of the Hevra Kadisha, or burial society, into a permanent institutional body responsible for public health and social welfare, ensuring that the displacement caused by the fire did not lead to the permanent disintegration of the ghetto's demographic core. The architectural focal point of this reconstruction was the significant expansion of the Pinchas Synagogue, undertaken by the prominent Horowitz family, led by Aaron Meshulam Horowitz. In 1535, the structure was transformed from a private family oratory into a monumental public house of prayer that reflected the early influence of the Renaissance on Central European Jewish engineering. The building utilized a reticulated vaulting system and late Gothic architectural motifs that were integrated with the burgeoning humanist aesthetics of the era, creating a physical bridge between medieval traditions and 16th century innovations. The expansion of the Pinchas Synagogue also involved the elevation of the floor level and the construction of massive stone walls designed specifically to prevent the rapid spread of fire, a technical adaptation learned from the 1516 disaster. The socio-economic resilience of the community during this era was further reinforced by the development of mutual aid syndicates, which managed the equitable redistribution of land plots within the cramped confines of the quarter. This internal land use management system prevented the Christian city council from seizing the burned territories, as the community maintained meticulous records of the ancient Jewish law regarding property rights and communal space. In 1523, King Louis Jagiello officially confirmed the community's right to rebuild, an act that prevented the Old Town burghers from turning the ruins into a municipal park or marketplace. This royal decree reaffirmed the Jewish population's status as indispensable taxpayers, as the Crown required the immediate restoration of the ghetto's commercial activities to fund the ongoing military preparations against Ottoman expansion. The reconstruction process also saw the introduction of more stringent fire safety regulations within the ghetto, including the mandatory use of brick chimneys and the replacement of thatched roofs with ceramic tiles. These improvements were funded through a centralized communal tax known as the Reconstruction Levy, which demonstrated the community's ability to generate significant capital independently of the royal treasury. By the late 1530s, the Jewish quarter had been transformed into one of the most densely populated and architecturally sophisticated urban enclaves in the Bohemian Kingdom, featuring a network of interconnected stone houses that supported a burgeoning class of artisans and scholars. This period of physical and institutional renewal provided the structural integrity that allowed the community to survive the legal and economic pressures of the early Habsburg administration, even as the political climate shifted toward the eventual expulsion decree of 1541. The year 1526 marked a decisive geopolitical pivot for the Kingdom of Bohemia, precipitated by the death of King Louis Jagiello at the Battle of Mohacs against the Ottoman forces of Suleiman the Magnificent. This dynastic vacuum led to the election of Ferdinand I of Habsburg, whose accession inaugurated nearly 4 centuries of Austrian rule over the Bohemian crown lands. Unlike his Jagiellonian predecessors, Ferdinand was a practitioner of early modern absolutism, viewing the Jewish community not merely as a localized municipal asset, but as a critical component of a centralized imperial fiscal strategy. In 1527, during his formal coronation ceremonies, Ferdinand confirmed the ancient privileges of the Jewish population, ostensibly upholding their status as servants of the royal chamber. This initial act of legal continuity was a pragmatic necessity, as the new monarch inherited a state treasury depleted by decades of noble encroachment and the immediate logistical demands of defending Central Europe against the advancing Ottoman armies. The administrative hallmark of the early Habsburg era was the establishment of the Hofkammer, or court chamber, in Vienna, which sought to bypass the traditional Bohemian Diet by centralizing the collection of Jewish taxes under a single imperial bureaucracy. This institutional shift created a direct channel of communication between the Prague ghetto and the sovereign, often mediated by court Jews, who functioned as official purveyors and financial advisors to the Habsburg military. These individuals were instrumental in procuring the massive quantities of saltpeter, grain, and lead required for the defense of the Austrian heartland during the 1529 siege of Vienna. In exchange for this logistical support, Ferdinand initially resisted the petitions of the Prague Old Town Council to restrict Jewish residency, recognizing that the community's liquid capital was essential for maintaining the professional mercenary units known as Landsknechte. However, the political landscape was complicated by the rapid spread of Lutheranism among the Bohemian nobility and the urban burghers, which created a religious schism that Ferdinand, a staunch Catholic, struggled to contain. To navigate this internal opposition, the king frequently utilized the Jewish community as a political counterweight, granting them renewed commercial licenses that challenged the economic autonomy of the Protestant-dominated guilds. This created a volatile environment where the Jewish quarter was inextricably linked to the king's unpopular centralizing reforms and his efforts to re-Catholicize the kingdom. The royal chancery's dependence on Jewish credit meant that the monarch could not easily satisfy the anti-Jewish demands of the estates. Yet the escalating costs of the Turkish wars eventually forced the king into a position of profound financial vulnerability. By the late 1530s, the initial Habsburg promises of protection began to erode under the weight of political necessity, as Ferdinand required the approval of the Bohemian Diet to authorize new war taxes. The Diet, composed of the high nobility and representatives from the royal towns, utilized these fiscal negotiations to demand concessions regarding the Jewish question, arguing that the king's protection of the ghetto was a violation of the rights of the Christian estates. This period saw the transition from a policy of imperial patronage to one of calculated expediency, where the sovereign's support for the Jewish community was no longer a matter of traditional legal obligation, but a negotiable asset in the broader struggle for Habsburg hegemony. The administrative machinery established during the first decade of Ferdinand's reign provided the very tools, specifically the new census and land registry systems, that would later be deployed to execute the mass displacement of 1541. As the monarch sought to reconcile his fiscal requirements with the political demands of a defiant Bohemian nobility, the early 16th century witnessed a profound paradigm shift in the intellectual landscape of the Prague Jewish town, as the community transitioned from the isolated scholasticism of the Middle Ages toward the multifaceted humanism of the Renaissance. This cultural flowering was catalyzed by the establishment of the first Hebrew printing press in Central Europe in 1512, an institutional milestone that fundamentally altered the transmission of knowledge and the standardization of liturgical and scientific texts. The printing house founded by the Gersonides, led by Gerson ben Solomon Cohen, utilized advanced movable type technology to produce the Prague Haggadah in 1526, a masterpiece of Renaissance typography that integrated traditional Hebrew script with sophisticated woodcut illustrations. This technological advancement facilitated a rapid increase in communal literacy and provided the logistical foundation for the dissemination of secular knowledge, including mathematics, grammar, and historiography, alongside traditional Talmudic exegesis. Central to this intellectual resurgence was the figure of David Gans, a polymath whose work bridged the gap between Ashkenazi religious tradition and the burgeoning scientific revolution of the 16th century. Gans, the author of the historiographical work Zema David, maintained active collaborative relationships with the leading astronomers of the era, including Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler, at the Imperial Observatory in Benátky nad Jizerou. His geographical and astronomical treatises reflected the adoption of Copernican observations within a Jewish cosmological framework, demonstrating a level of cross-cultural scientific exchange that was unprecedented in the Bohemian Crown lands. The presence of Gans and his contemporaries signaled the emergence of a Jewish republic of letters, where the study of the natural world was viewed not as a distraction from sacred study, but as a necessary component of the humanist ideal of the universal man. This era also saw the transformative pedagogical reforms of Judah Lo ben Bezalel, known as the Maharal, who advocated for a systematic approach to education that emphasized the rational progression of learning and the study of Hebrew grammar as a prerequisite for legal analysis. While his most famous philosophical works were codified later in the century, his early 16th century foundations introduced a synthesis of Kabbalistic mysticism and Renaissance rationalism that sought to reconcile the mechanics of the universe with the divine law. The intellectual life of the ghetto was further enriched by a highly educated class of Jewish physicians, many of whom had received training at the University of Padua or other Italian medical schools before returning to Prague. These practitioners introduced the latest anatomical and pharmacological knowledge to the Bohemian capital, often serving as intermediaries between the Jewish community and the humanist circles of the royal court and the high nobility. The intellectual flowering was not limited to the sciences, but extended to the development of Hebrew poetry and the refinement of the Judeo-German language, or early Yiddish, which began to emerge as a vehicle for both popular literature and technical instruction. The community's commitment to archival preservation and the systematic collection of historical precedents created a unique communal memory that supported the legal defenses of the ghetto during political crises. This period of academic and scientific vitality occurred within a cosmopolitan environment where the Jewish town functioned as an intellectual conduit between the Mediterranean world and the northern steppes, ensuring that the Prague ghetto remained a primary center of Jewish learning in Europe. The synthesis of traditional religious authority with Renaissance humanist inquiry provided the community with the psychological and cultural resilience necessary to navigate the increasingly hostile political environment of the 1530s, as the intellectual prestige of the ghetto often clashed with the growing municipal demands for its total elimination. The theological landscape of the early 16th century underwent a systemic fragmentation that significantly altered the security of the Prague Jewish town, as the Protestant Reformation and the subsequent Catholic reaction introduced new paradigms of religious exclusion. While the previous century's Hussite movement had focused on internal Bohemian reforms, the rise of Lutheranism in the 1520s and 30s imported a pan-European dogmatic polarization that reached the Vltava basin with profound intensity. This era of confessionalization transformed the Jewish community into a focal point for the competing anxieties of the Catholic Habsburg court and the increasingly radicalized Protestant estates. The initial Lutheran emphasis on sola scriptura had prompted a brief, scholarly interest in Hebrew philology among Christian humanists. Yet this intellectual curiosity was rapidly superseded by a more aggressive form of supersessionist theology that sought to resolve the Jewish question through either total conversion or complete removal. Martin Luther's shifting public stance, which moved from the relative tolerance of his 1523 treatises toward the increasingly bellicose rhetoric of the 1530s, provided a fresh ideological framework for the anti-Jewish petitions of the Prague Old Town burghers. These municipal leaders, many of whom had adopted Lutheran or neo-Utraquist sympathies, utilized the rhetoric of godly order to argue that the continued presence of the Jewish quarter was an impediment to the spiritual purification of the city. By framing economic competition as a matter of religious necessity, the urban guilds were able to mobilize a broader segment of the populace, linking the survival of the Christian faith to the elimination of the unbelieving competitors within the ghetto. This created a volatile urban environment, where localized religious riots were often used as a mechanism to pressure the royal administration into making concessions regarding residency rights. Simultaneously, the emerging Counter-Reformation, spearheaded by the Catholic hierarchy under Ferdinand I, sought to re-establish a uniform religious orthodoxy that left little room for the traditional, pragmatic tolerance of the Middle Ages. The Catholic Church began to implement the decrees of various provincial synods that mandated stricter physical and social separation between Christians and Jews, viewing the ghetto not as a royal asset, but as a theological anomaly that required containment. The 1536 papal bull of Paul III, while nominally protecting certain Jewish rights, also reinforced the necessity of the yellow badge and the prohibition of social interaction, providing the legal basis for the municipal authorities in Prague to enforce new, restrictive dress codes and curfews. This institutional squeeze from both the Protestant reformers and the Catholic traditionalists meant that the Jewish community no longer occupied a stable middle ground but was instead caught in a pincer movement of competing dogmas. The socio-political volatility of the 1530s was further exacerbated by the Anabaptist scares in the neighboring Germanic lands, which led the Bohemian authorities to implement a state of heightened surveillance over all non-conforming religious groups. The Jewish town was frequently subjected to unannounced searches by royal provosts seeking heretical literature or evidence of clandestine political alliances, reflecting a growing paranoia that linked religious nonconformity with treason. During the sessions of the Bohemian Diet in 1537, the Protestant nobles argued that the royal protection of the Jewish community was a symptom of Catholic corruption, while Catholic officials countered that the Jewish presence was a direct result of the chaos caused by the Reformation itself. This period of ideological fracture ensured that by the dawn of the 1540s, the religious status of the Jewish population was no longer a settled matter of royal law, but a volatile point of contention in the struggle for the spiritual and political soul of Bohemia. A systemic credit crisis fundamentally defined and repositioned the Bohemian nobility from a class of territorial lords to a class of heavily leveraged debtors. This economic transformation was driven by the increasing costs of the early modern courtly lifestyle and the massive capital requirements for military modernization, which forced the knights and high aristocracy to seek liquidity beyond the yields of their landed estates. Unlike the urban guilds, whose grievances were rooted in trade competition, the resentment of the Bohemian estates was centered on the accumulation of interest-bearing debt owed to Jewish banking families. These creditors provided the necessary cash flow for the nobility to fulfill their service obligations to the Habsburg crown, yet the structural inability of the agricultural economy to generate rapid returns led to a cycle of compounding arrears that threatened the hereditary titles and ancestral lands of the Bohemian ruling class. The legal instruments of this indebtedness were the obligatory notes or bonds, which were frequently recorded in the Jewish registries, or Kniha Żydowska, a specialized branch of the land court. By the mid-1530s, the total volume of debt registered against the noble estates had reached a level that the Bohemian Diet characterized as a threat to the sovereignty of the kingdom. The interest rates, which typically ranged between 20% and 30% annually depending on the risk assessment of the lender, were increasingly labeled as predatory usury by the debtors, who utilized their legislative power in the Diet to demand state-mandated interest caps. In 1534, the estates petitioned King Ferdinand I to enact a general cancellation of interest payments, arguing that the financial burden of these private debts hindered their ability to provide the war taxes required for the defense of the Austrian borders. This financial friction created a powerful political incentive for expulsion, as the removal of the Jewish population offered a pragmatic mechanism for the unilateral annulment of outstanding credit contracts. The nobility realized that if the Jewish community were banished from the Bohemian crown lands, the legal standing of their debt obligations would become unenforceable, effectively conducting a massive transfer of wealth from the creditors back to the landed elite. This debtor's logic transformed the Jewish question from a matter of religious or municipal policy into a strategy for aristocratic solvency. During the Diet sessions of 1537, the representatives of the knightly estate explicitly linked the economic survival of their families to the total removal of the Jewish chamber servants, framing the expulsion as an act of patriotic liberation from financial bondage. The king's initial resistance to these demands was rooted in the fact that many of these same Jewish financiers were the primary lenders to the royal treasury, making their expulsion a double-edged sword for the Habsburg administration. However, the nobility countered this by threatening to withhold military subsidies unless the king addressed the insolvency of the estates. This fiscal blackmail was supported by the municipal councils, who sought to combine their own market-driven grievances with the nobility's debt-driven resentment. By 1540, the political consensus among the Bohemian estates had solidified around the belief that the expulsion was not merely desirable but economically mandatory to prevent the total foreclosure of the kingdom's elite. This period of acute financial tension ensured that when the catastrophic events of 1541 provided a plausible pretext, the legal and social mechanisms for a mass displacement were already fully articulated by a debtor class seeking an escape from their financial reality. The decade of the 1530s in the Bohemian capital was characterized by an intensifying cycle of administrative lobbying, as the municipal governments of the old and new towns transitioned from sporadic physical incursions to a sophisticated and sustained bureaucratic assault on the Jewish quarter. This era is defined in the archival record by a dense paper trail of petitions, manifestos, and legal briefs submitted by the Christian Guild leadership to the royal chancery of Ferdinand I. These documents sought to leverage the king's ongoing fiscal difficulties to secure a definitive revocation of Jewish residency rights, framing the presence of the ghetto not as a religious anomaly, but as a systemic violation of the golden liberties of the royal towns. The primary architects of this strategy were the members of the Old Town Council, who established specialized committees to draft the Articuli Judiorum, or Articles Concerning the Jews, which were presented at every major session of the Bohemian Diet throughout the decade. In 1531, a landmark petition was submitted to the monarch, articulating for the first time a unified front between the textile, metalworking, and leather guilds, who argued that the Jewish community's exemption from municipal tolls constituted an illegal subversion of the city's chartered market rights. The petitioners demanded that the king enforce a strict exclusionary policy that would prohibit Jewish merchants from engaging in any form of retail trade beyond the gates of the ghetto, effectively proposing an economic blockade. This administrative pressure was reinforced by the work of the Six-Men Committee, a group of municipal magistrates who conducted unauthorized censuses within the Jewish quarter to identify foreign Jews, those without established residency, permits whom they sought to expel immediately as a precursor to a general banishment. These registries were utilized as evidence in 1535 to argue before the royal court that the ghetto had reached a demographic density that threatened the public order and fire safety of the neighboring Christian parishes. The petitions of the mid-1530s also focused on the right of preemption, a legal doctrine the Guild sought to revive to prevent Jewish wholesalers from purchasing raw materials such as wool, hops, and hides before they reached the municipal markets. The municipal councils funded these lobbying efforts through extraordinary levies on their own members, creating a political war chest used to dispatch delegations to Vienna and Linz to personally petition the emperor's advisors. In 1537, the rhetoric of these documents shifted toward a more urgent tone, as the Prague burghers argued that the Jewish community was acting as a state within a state, maintaining independent judicial and fiscal structures that undermined the king's own centralizing reforms. This strategy was designed to provoke Ferdinand's authoritarian instincts, suggesting that the traditional royal protection of the chamber servants was an obsolete medieval relic that hindered the development of a modern, unified urban administration. Ferdinand I's responses to these petitions during this decade were consistently dilatory, as the monarch sought to balance the immediate capital requirements provided by Jewish financiers against the political necessity of maintaining the loyalty of the royal towns. However, the persistent paper war waged by the guilds succeeded in shifting the burden of proof onto the Jewish community, which was forced to submit its own counter-petitions and ancient charters for royal verification. By 1539, the volume of anti-Jewish litigation had created an atmosphere of legal exhaustion within the royal chancery, preparing the institutional groundwork for the king to finally concede to the municipal demands when a suitable catalyst emerged. This decade of bureaucratic maneuvering thus transformed the expulsion from a radical municipal ambition into an administrative inevitability, as the constant accumulation of grievances in the royal archives provided the legal justification for the eventual decree of 1541. The geopolitical atmosphere of the 1530s was defined by an escalating existential dread within the Habsburg territories, precipitated by the catastrophic collapse of the Hungarian buffer state and the direct threat posed by the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent. Within this climate of military high alert, a dangerous political myth emerged that sought to reframe the Jewish community of Prague not as an internal economic competitor, but as a strategic fifth column, operating in secret alliance with the High Porte in Constantinople. This accusation of treachery was built upon the community's unique position within the transcontinental trade networks that spanned the Mediterranean, where Jewish merchants maintained familial and commercial ties with the large Sephardic centers of Salonika and Istanbul. The Christian municipal authorities in Prague began to interpret these legitimate commercial correspondences as clandestine intelligence channels, suggesting that Jewish agents were providing the Sultan with technical data regarding Bohemian fortifications and the movements of the imperial Landsknechte. The Turkish spy myth was further propagated through the dissemination of fabricated or misinterpreted letters purportedly intercepted at the border of the Ottoman-held territories. These documents, often discussed with gravity in the sessions of the Bohemian Diet, alleged that Jewish financiers were actively transferring bullion to the Sultan's treasury to fund the expansion of the Ottoman navy. The fact that many Jewish families had sought refuge in Ottoman lands following the Spanish expulsion of 1492 provided a surface-level plausibility to these claims, as the Ottoman administration was known for its pragmatic tolerance of Jewish skilled laborers and physicians. In the eyes of the paranoid Habsburg bureaucracy, this cultural and religious affinity was equated with political treason, leading to a state of heightened surveillance over the Prague Jewish town that surpassed any previous medieval precedent. Ferdinand I, while initially skeptical of these accusations due to his reliance on Jewish logistics for his own military campaigns, eventually utilized the Turkish threat as a mechanism for expanding royal police powers. In 1538, the royal chancery issued a series of instructions to the Prague burgrave, mandating the systematic censorship of all Hebrew and Yiddish mail crossing the Vltava. This institutionalized suspicion was reinforced by the popular press and itinerant preachers, who integrated the Turkish spy trope into the broader rhetoric of the Counter-Reformation, arguing that the infidel outside the gates was being aided by the unbeliever within. This psychological warfare had the effect of isolating the Jewish quarter from the rest of the urban population, as ordinary interactions between Christian and Jewish artisans were now scrutinized for signs of espionage or sedition. The judicial consequences of this myth were immediate and severe. Throughout the late 1530s, several prominent Jewish residents were subjected to extraordinary interrogations based on unfounded denunciations by their Christian debtors. These legal proceedings often focused on the supposed existence of a secret Jewish council that met to discuss the downfall of the Christian world, a thematic precursor to later conspiracy theories that gained traction during periods of societal stress. By 1540, the perception of the Jewish community as a national security risk had become so entrenched in the Bohemian political consciousness that the traditional royal protections were viewed as a liability to the safety of the empire. This shift from economic grievance to accusations of high treason provided the necessary ideological justification for the eventual mass displacement, ensuring that when the catastrophe of 1541 occurred, the populace was already primed to view the Jewish community through the lens of betrayal and foreign manipulation. On the 2nd of June, 1541, the political and administrative stability of the Bohemian kingdom was fundamentally compromised by a catastrophic conflagration that originated within the residential quarters of the Mala Strana, or Lesser Town, and rapidly ascended the slopes of the Rajani Hill. This fire, occurring during a period of extreme summer drought and propelled by intense southern winds along the Vltava Valley, surpassed all previous urban disasters in its sheer destructive capacity and its immediate impact on the central government. Within a period of less than 3 hours, the fire breached the defensive fortifications of Prague Castle, decimating the royal palace, the St. Vitus Cathedral, and the administrative offices of the Bohemian Chancellery. The architectural loss was accompanied by a logistical crisis of unprecedented proportions, as the fire incinerated the primary stone-built repositories of the state archives, including the majority of the land tables, or Zemsky Deski, which served as the official legal registry of noble titles, land ownership, and hereditary debts. The destruction of the land tables created an immediate administrative vacuum and a profound sense of legal panic among the Bohemian estates. For the nobility, the loss of these documents represented both a threat to their ancestral claims and a convenient opportunity to obfuscate their private financial obligations. In the chaotic aftermath of the blaze, which left over 2/3 of the lesser town in ruins and displaced thousands of Christian residents, the search for a definitive cause shifted rapidly from accidental negligence to deliberate sabotage. Despite the absence of forensic evidence, the municipal authorities and the royal court propagated the narrative that the fire was an act of arson. This accusation was systematically directed at the Jewish community, leveraging the pre-existing Turkish spy myths and the economic resentments that had reached a tipping point during the preceding decade of bureaucratic petitioning. The scapegoating of the Jewish population was predicated on the unfounded claim that Jewish agents, acting under the direction of foreign powers or seeking to destroy the records of their noble debtors, had coordinated the ignition of multiple points within the castle precincts. This narrative served a dual political purpose. It diverted popular anger away from the king's own failure to provide adequate fire safety infrastructure and provided the Bohemian nobility with a moral justification for the unilateral repudiation of their debts. Within days of the fire, the royal provosts initiated a series of mass arrests within the Jewish quarter, subjecting residents to intensive interrogations centered on the supposed existence of incendiary devices and secret communications with Ottoman intermediaries. The Great Fire of 1541 functioned as the definitive catalyst that transformed the long-standing municipal desire for expulsion into an official royal mandate. Ferdinand I, who had previously maintained a policy of pragmatic protection for the chamber servants, utilized the atmosphere of emergency and the loss of the royal archives to satisfy the demands of the Bohemian Diet. The monarch's transition from protector to persecutor was finalized in the autumn of 1541, as the fire provided the necessary legal cover of public safety and national treason to bypass the ancient charters of the Statuta Judiorum. This period of thermal and political upheaval ensured that the physical destruction of the capital was inextricably linked to the legislative destruction of the Jewish presence in Bohemia, setting the stage for the formal decree of expulsion that would follow in the immediate wake of the castle's ruins. The immediate aftermath of the June 1541 conflagration was characterized by the rapid crystallization of a specific judicial narrative that identified the Jewish quarter as the primary source of the catastrophe. This process of scapegoating was not a spontaneous reaction to the tragedy, but was facilitated by the fama publica, or common rumor, which was systematically manipulated by the leadership of the Old Town municipal councils. Within 48 hours of the fire's containment, the administrative discourse shifted from environmental factors, such as the prolonged drought, to the criminal charge of incendium dolosum, or willful arson. Despite the total absence of physical evidence, no incendiary devices or logistical caches were ever recovered from the ruins of the lesser town. The royal provosts initiated a series of targeted raids within the ghetto, centering on individuals who had recently returned from commercial missions to the Hungarian borderlands. The judicial mechanics of the scapegoating relied heavily on the use of extraordinary measures during interrogations. Several Jewish residents were transported to the dungeons of the Old Town Hall, where they were subjected to the peinliche Fragestellung, or judicial torture, to extract confessions that linked the fire to a broader geopolitical conspiracy. These coarse testimonies alleged that the arsonists were acting as paid agents of the Ottoman Sultan, tasked with destroying the Bohemian land tables to induce a state of administrative paralysis. The transcripts of these interrogations were read aloud in the public squares of Prague, serving to transform the private grief of the displaced Christian population into a collective wave of popular fury. This anger was strategically directed at the Jewish town, which had remained largely untouched by the flames due to its location on the opposite bank of the Vltava, a geographical fact that was misinterpreted by the mob as proof of divine or demonic protection. The popular anger reached a threshold in July 1541 that the royal court could no longer ignore without risking a full-scale insurrection by the urban guilds. While Ferdinand I had initially sought to maintain the legal standards of the Statuta Judiorum, the political cost of protecting a population accused of high treason became unsustainable. The King's Council in Vienna received a series of urgent reports from the Prague Burgrave, stating that the king's peace could only be restored through a decisive act of judicial exclusion. This pressure was compounded by the fact that the fire had destroyed the very documents, the land tables, that provided the legal basis for royal oversight of noble properties, leaving the monarch in a state of extreme political vulnerability before the Bohemian estates. The transition from suspicion to official policy was finalized when the royal administration adopted the rhetoric of public safety as a justification for suspending traditional Jewish privileges. This allowed the court to frame the upcoming expulsion not as a religious persecution, but as a necessary measure of internal security to prevent further foreign-led sabotage. The scapegoating process thus provided a convenient legal mechanism for the crown to satisfy the long-standing economic demands of the Christian burghers, while simultaneously punishing the unbelieving creditors of the nobility. By late summer, the psychological isolation of the Jewish quarter was complete. The district was effectively placed under a military blockade, with its residents prohibited from entering the municipal markets or communicating with their Christian counterparts. This period of intense communal vilification established the moral and political consensus required for the issuance of the formal expulsion decree, ensuring that the departure of the Jewish population would be viewed by the Christian populace as a just and necessary act of national purification. The formalization of the mass displacement was codified on the 1st of September, 1541, when Ferdinand I issued the General Edict of Expulsion from his temporary court in Linz. This royal mandate represented a definitive revocation of the medieval Statuta Judiorum, effectively nullifying the servant of the royal chamber status that had protected the community for nearly 3 centuries. The legal preamble of the decree did not rely on traditional theological arguments, but instead utilized the emergency powers of the crown to address public treachery and the safety of the realm, explicitly citing the Great Fire of June as the judicial justification for the total removal of the Jewish population from the lands of the Bohemian crown. Unlike previous localized municipal bans, this was a comprehensive state act that extended its jurisdiction across the entirety of Bohemia, with a secondary mandate prepared for the Margraviate of Moravia to prevent internal migration within the Habsburg territories. The timeline established for the city of Prague was exceptionally rigorous, reflecting the urgency of the municipal councils to finalize the liquidation of their economic competitors before the onset of winter. The decree mandated that all Jewish residents of the Prague ghetto, regardless of age or social standing, were to vacate the city walls by the Feast of St. Martin, or the 11th of November, 1541. This 70-day window was designed to facilitate the rapid inventory of communal assets by the royal chamber, ensuring that any property not sold at a fraction of its value by the deadline would automatically escheat to the state treasury. To manage the logistics of the exodus, the royal burgrave established a specialized commission known as the Expulsion Directorate, which was tasked with issuing individual exit permits and verifying that all outstanding taxes and fire indemnities had been paid in full before a family was allowed to pass through the city gates. A critical legal feature of the 1541 mandate was the suspension of the salvus conductus, or safe passage, which had historically protected Jewish travelers from the extrajudicial seizures of the nobility. Under the new decree, any Jewish individual found within the borders of Bohemia after the expiration of the deadline was classified as an outlaw, subject to immediate arrest and the confiscation of all remaining portable wealth. The mandate also included a specific clause prohibiting Christian citizens from harboring Jewish refugees or acting as proxies for Jewish commercial interests, a measure intended to prevent the hidden residency that had allowed the community to survive previous periods of persecution. For the Prague community, this meant the immediate cessation of all legal protections in the civil courts, leaving them unable to collect on the very debts that had fueled the nobility's resentment. As the November deadline approached, the Royal Chancery issued a series of supplementary instructions that refined the exit protocols, mandating that the exiles follow specific designated routes toward the Polish border or the southern territories of the Holy Roman Empire. These instructions were designed to prevent the refugees from settling in the private towns of the Bohemian nobility, who had attempted to offer temporary sanctuary to their primary creditors. The legal finality of the document was reinforced by the requirement that the community leaders surrender the keys to the Old New Synagogue and the Jewish Town Hall to the Old Town magistrates, marking the formal dissolution of the Jewish corporate entity in Prague. By the end of 1541, the decree had transformed the vibrant urban microcosm of the ghetto into a collection of abandoned masonry shells as the administrative machinery of the Habsburg state successfully executed the first total expulsion in the history of the Bohemian kingdom. The implementation of the expulsion decree triggered an immediate and systemic collapse of the Jewish real estate and commodity markets within the Prague-Vltava basin. As the 70-day window established by the Linz Mandate began to close, the approximately 600 stone-built residences and communal structures of the Jewish town were subjected to a process of forced liquidation that operated under conditions of extreme asymmetric bargaining. The legal requirement that all fixed assets be sold to Christian buyers before the November 11th deadline created a saturated market where the supply of property vastly exceeded the available liquid capital of the Old Town burghers. Consequently, property values plummeted to a fraction of their insured or historical worth, with contemporary appraisals indicating that most masonry houses were exchanged for less than 10% of their construction cost. The mechanics of these transactions were overseen by the Royal Chamber's Commission of Assessment, which mandated that every sale be recorded in the municipal land registries to ensure the collection of a significant transfer tax for the state treasury. This commission often acted in collusion with the Christian guilds, allowing prospective buyers to wait until the final weeks of October to finalize purchases, knowing that the threat of royal escheatment would force Jewish owners into desperate concessions. If a property remained unsold by the Feast of St. Martin, the ownership automatically reverted to the Bohemian crown without compensation, providing a powerful incentive for the Christian citizenry to avoid early bidding. This resulted in a massive state-sanctioned transfer of wealth, as the high-quality Renaissance architecture of the ghetto, including private oratories, refined courtyards, and commercial warehouses, was systematically absorbed by the urban elite of the Old Town. Beyond real estate, The liquidation extended to the vast inventories of the Jewish merchant class, including stockpiles of raw silk, processed leather, and imported spices. Because the decree prohibited exiles from transporting heavy or high-volume goods through the narrow mountain passes toward the Polish border, these inventories were liquidated in fire sales held within the courtyard of the Jewish town hall. Christian retailers utilized these auctions to acquire high-value commodities at wholesale prices, which they then resold in the municipal markets at a significant markup once the Jewish competition had been removed. The financial extraction was further intensified by the final settlement tax, a levy imposed by the royal burgrave to cover the perceived costs of the expulsion administration and the outstanding fire indemnities blamed on the community. The liquidation process also targeted the intangible assets of the community, specifically the active credit contracts and promissory notes held by Jewish financiers. While the decree technically allowed for the collection of debts before departure, the judicial suspension of Jewish legal standing meant that Christian debtors frequently refused payment, knowing that the creditors lacked the time or the standing to pursue litigation in the royal courts. Many families were forced to sell these debt instruments to Christian speculators for pennies on the groschen, effectively conducting a secondary liquidation of the community's financial future. By the first week of November, the economic infrastructure of the Prague Jewish community had been thoroughly dismantled, leaving the departing families with only the portable wealth they could physically carry or conceal within their clothing. This period of rapid capital flight and asset devaluation ensured that the community entered their forced migration in a state of profound economic exhaustion, while the municipal coffers of Prague and the royal treasury of Ferdinand I were enriched by the systematic plundering of 3 centuries of accumulated Jewish wealth. The parliamentary sessions of the Bohemian Diet, convened in the late summer of 1541, represented a decisive shift in the constitutional balance of power between the Habsburg monarchy and the provincial estates. While the royal decree issued from Linz provided the executive mandate for the expulsion, it was the legislative action of the Diet that integrated this displacement into the permanent legal fabric of the kingdom. This assembly occurred within an atmosphere of acute political opportunism, as the high nobility, the knights, and the representatives of the royal towns utilized the destruction of the land tables to renegotiate the fundamental statutes of the realm. The Diet of 1541 was not merely a consultative body, but functioned as a supreme legislative authority that sought to rectify what the estates perceived as centuries of royal overreach regarding the protection of the Jewish chamber servants. The sessions were defined by the triumph of the estates, a term used by constitutional historians to describe the moment when the collective will of the Bohemian ruling class successfully superseded the traditional prerogatives of the crown. The delegates argued that since the original charters of the 13th century had been incinerated in the Great Fire, the legal status of the Jewish community had effectively ceased to exist, leaving a vacuum that only the Diet had the authority to fill. This allowed the estates to draft the new land ordinance, which codified the expulsion as a matter of provincial law rather than a temporary royal whim. By voting this measure into the official record of the proceedings, the nobility ensured that any future attempts by the monarch to invite the Jewish community back to Prague would require the explicit consent of the Diet, thereby stripping the king of his exclusive jurisdiction over non-Christian residents. The debates in Parliament focused heavily on the incompatibility of jurisdictions, with the speakers for the royal towns arguing that the existence of a separate Jewish legal administration within the city walls was an affront to municipal sovereignty. The Diet's committees for judicial reform proposed that the removal of the Jewish state within a state was a prerequisite for the restoration of the ancient liberties of Bohemia. This legislative rhetoric transformed the expulsion from a punitive reaction to the fire into a foundational act of administrative modernization. The consensus reached during these sessions was unique in its cross-estate unity. The high nobility, who sought to erase their private debts, found common cause with the urban burghers, who sought to eliminate market competition. This alliance effectively neutralized any remaining royal hesitation, as Ferdinand I could not afford to alienate the very assembly that was responsible for authorizing the subsidies required to rebuild the burnt administrative offices of the Prague castle. The final act of the 1541 Diet was the formal registration of the ban into the newly reconstituted land tables. This act of recording ensured that the expulsion was no longer a matter of active litigation but a settled historical fact, providing a legal precedent that would influence Bohemian jurisprudence for the next generation. The Diet also established the Commission of Sequestration, a parliamentary body tasked with ensuring that the escheatment of Jewish properties benefited the provincial treasury as much as the royal court. By the conclusion of the autumn sessions, the Bohemian Diet had successfully transformed a moment of catastrophic loss into a legislative victory, establishing a confessional and economic hegemony that marginalized the Jewish presence for decades. This period of parliamentary codification thus represented the institutional finality of the expulsion, marking the moment when the representative body of the Bohemian nation collectively endorsed the total removal of the Jewish community as a necessary step toward the preservation of aristocratic and municipal power. The physical enactment of the expulsion mandate commenced on the 11th of November, 1541, marking the definitive cessation of Jewish residency within the fortified perimeters of Prague. As the sun rose on the feast of St. Martin, the logistical execution of the exodus was overseen by the royal provosts and the municipal militia, who established specialized checkpoints at the primary exit points of the city, specifically the Gate of St. Benedict and the routes leading toward the northern mountain passes. The departing population, estimated by contemporary tax registries to be between 2,000 and 3,000 individuals, was organized into heavily laden caravans consisting of ox-drawn wagons and handcarts. Each family was subjected to a final, rigorous search by royal customs officers, who were instructed to seize any concealed bullion, unappraised jewelry, or, most critically, any surviving Hebrew ledgers and promissory notes that might allow for the future collection of debts from the Bohemian nobility. The technical management of the departure required each exile to present a safe passage certificate, a document purchased from the royal chancellery that nominally protected the bearer from extrajudicial seizure until they reached the territorial borders of the Bohemian crown. These caravans were forced to follow strictly designated corridors to prevent the refugees from seeking sanctuary in the private jurisdictions of the rural aristocracy. The northern route, which attracted the largest contingent of the Prague exiles, proceeded through the Sudeten passes into the Duchy of Silesia, eventually converging on the established Jewish centers of Krakow and Lublin in the Kingdom of Poland. This migration was facilitated by the existing commercial infrastructure of the Via Regia, though the late autumn frost and the range of winter significantly impeded the movement of the elderly and the infirm, who were prohibited from remaining within the city limits under the threat of summary execution. A secondary exodus directed itself southward, navigating the precarious political landscape of the Margraviate of Moravia before descending into the Ottoman-controlled territories of the Hungarian plain. This group was primarily composed of those with established familial links to the Sephardic communities of the Levant, seeking the relative legal stability offered by the Ottoman millet system. The logistical escort provided by the royal guards ended at the border crossings, where the exiles were required to surrender their Bohemian residency papers, effectively rendering them stateless individuals under the protection of foreign sovereigns. Throughout this process, the expulsion tax was collected at every river crossing and mountain toll station, ensuring that the remaining liquid assets of the community were systematically depleted before they exited the kingdom. The departure from the gates of Prague was characterized by a profound administrative finality. The names of the departing heads of households were struck from the municipal tax rolls, and the corporate seals of the Jewish community were surrendered to the royal burgrave. By the evening of the 11th of November, the gates of the Jewish town were physically barred and guarded by municipal watchmen, signaling the end of the legal presence of the Jewish chamber servants in the Bohemian capital. This mass movement of people and capital represented one of the most significant demographic shifts in 16th century Central Europe, as the expertise and commercial networks of the Prague ghetto were forcibly redistributed toward the burgeoning urban centers of the East and the South. The immediate result was the creation of a vast network of Bohemian Jewish exiles, who would maintain their cultural and linguistic traditions in the Polish and Ottoman lands, creating a lasting diaspora that remained centered on the memory of the Vltava Valley. The transition of the Jewish quarter from a densely populated urban enclave to a demographic vacuum following the 11th of November, 1541, was immediately followed by a period of systemic extraction and unauthorized plundering. While the royal decree had nominally transferred the ownership of unsold properties to the Bohemian crown, the physical reality within the gated district was defined by a breakdown of municipal order that allowed local mobs from the Old Town to engage in the wholesale stripping of the ghetto's infrastructure. This ransacking was not merely a pursuit of hidden treasure, but a systematic dismantling of the masonry and interior fixtures of the abandoned residences. Christian scavengers, often identified in subsequent municipal court records as apprentices and day laborers from the neighboring parishes, forcibly entered the stone houses to remove valuable building materials, including lead from the roofing, copper piping, and iron window grills, which were then resold as raw scrap in the city's metal markets. The communal and religious properties of the Jewish town, which had been surrendered to the royal burgrave, became the primary targets for institutionalized seizure. The Old New Synagogue and the Pinkas Synagogue were subjected to a rigorous inventory of confiscation, conducted by representatives of the royal chamber. During this process, the liturgical paraphernalia that had not been carried away by the exiles, including silver Torah finials, or rimonim, embroidered paraquet curtains, and ornamental breastplates, was catalogued as state property. A significant portion of these precious metal objects was immediately transported to the royal mint to be melted down into bullion, providing the Habsburg treasury with a rapid infusion of liquid capital to offset the costs of the ongoing reconstruction of Prague Castle. The sacred Torah scrolls that remained were often viewed by the municipal authorities not as religious texts, but as high-quality parchment, which was subsequently sold to local bookbinders and used as reinforcing material for the bindings of Christian administrative ledgers and university manuscripts. The Jewish Town Hall, the administrative heart of the district, was ransacked for its remaining archival records. While the exiles had attempted to preserve their primary legal charters, the vast secondary repositories of communal registers, birth records, and internal judicial files were largely abandoned. These documents were systematically gathered by the Commission of Sequestration to be searched for evidence of outstanding Christian debts that might have escaped the earlier liquidations. Any papers deemed of no fiscal value were frequently used as fuel for the municipal furnaces or left to decay in the unheated buildings. The physical desecration extended to the interior of the synagogues, where the almamor grills and stone masonry were often damaged as looters searched for foundation caches or hidden cavities within the thick Gothic walls. By the end of November 1541, the institutional seizure was finalized as the Old Town Municipal Council took formal possession of the communal bathhouse and the hospital, repurposing these structures for Christian civic use. The old Jewish cemetery, while not immediately leveled, was subjected to the theft of its newer, high-quality stone markers, which were repurposed as building material for the repair of the city walls and the foundations of new Christian residences in the lesser town. This period of plundering ensured that the physical presence of the Jewish community was not merely displaced, but architecturally and economically cannibalized by the surrounding city. The transition from a vibrant autonomous district to a collection of hollowed-out stone shells was completed within weeks of the departure, leaving the Jewish town as a physical monument to the total extraction of communal wealth and the final triumph of the municipal guilds over their former competitors. The programmatic desacralization of the religious topography of the Jewish quarter followed the administrative finality of the Exodus, as the municipal authorities of Prague sought to transform the district from a distinct ethnic enclave into a functional extension of the Christian Old Town. This process was defined by the deliberate erasure of Jewish liturgical and cultural markers, overseen by the Prague Archbishopric and the Royal Burgrave's office. The High Synagogue, a prominent structural landmark of the ghetto, was subjected to immediate conversion into a municipal storehouse for grain and hops, a move that served the dual purpose of utilizing its high-vaulted interior for guild logistics while symbolically stripping the building of its sacred character. The interior furnishings, including the wooden pews and the ornamental dividers of the women's gallery, were dismantled and utilized as firewood for the city's public bakeries, ensuring that the physical evidence of congregational life was systematically obliterated. The Old New Synagogue, despite its stone-built resilience, underwent a series of external alterations intended to obscure its Jewish identity and integrate it into the surrounding Gothic architecture of the Old Town. The Hebrew epigraphy that had adorned the stone lintels and the entrance tympanum was chiseled away by municipal stonemasons, replaced in some instances by neutral floral motifs or the heraldry of the royal chamber. The specific sun and star gables that had distinguished the building's silhouette were partially leveled or modified to match the residential aesthetics of the neighboring Christian parishes. Within the prayer hall, the empty Torah Ark, or Aron Kodesh, was repurposed as a secure cabinet for the storage of municipal tax registries, a transformation that reflected the total subordination of the sacred space to the fiscal requirements of the Habsburg state. The old Jewish cemetery was subjected to a different form of desecration, centered on the commodification of its space and the physical erasure of its memorial identity. While the most recent and high-quality marble markers had been stolen during the initial plundering, the older, more weathered headstones were often toppled and buried beneath a layer of fresh topsoil to create garden plots for the urban poor, or to level the ground for new municipal thoroughfares. The archbishopric authorized the removal of superstitious inscriptions from the surviving monuments, viewing the Hebrew text as a spiritual threat to the orthodoxy of the neighboring Christian quarters. The soil of the ancestors, which had been carefully accumulated over generations due to the limited burial space, was in some areas excavated and sold as enriched earth for the development of private estates in the lesser town, representing a complete disregard for the traditional Jewish prohibitions against the disturbance of human remains. The systematic erasure ensured that by the end of 1542, the Jewish town had been topographically and symbolically absorbed into the Christian city, leaving only the hollow shells of buildings as a vestigial reminder of the community that had inhabited the Vltava basin for centuries. The transformation of sacred spaces into profane utilities marked the final phase of the expulsion's implementation, aimed at ensuring that the memory of the Jewish presence would not survive the physical departure of the people. The immediate aftermath of the 1541 expulsion was defined by a systemic and acute contraction of the Bohemian economy, as the removal of Jewish capital triggered a profound liquidity crisis within the Prague marketplace. Throughout the early months of 1542, the administrative records of the Old Town Municipal Council indicate a significant decline in the volume of commercial transactions, a direct consequence of the sudden disappearance of the credit infrastructure that had sustained urban trade for centuries. While the Christian guilds had successfully eliminated their primary competitors, they quickly discovered that the Jewish community had functioned as the circulatory system of the city's financial life, providing the short-term loans and currency exchange services necessary for the procurement of raw materials and the distribution of finished goods. The resulting credit vacuum forced many small-scale Christian artisans into insolvency, as they lacked the independent capital reserves to maintain production cycles without the flexible financing previously provided by the financiers of the ghetto. The fiscal impact on the royal treasury of Ferdinand I was equally severe, as the monarch was deprived of the consistent revenue stream generated by the Kammerschilling, or Jewish chamber tax. The loss of this predictable liquid capital forced the royal chancellery to rely more heavily on extraordinary subsidies from the Bohemian Diet, granting the nobility even greater leverage over the crown's military and administrative agenda. Additionally, the sudden absence of Jewish metallurgical experts and minting contractors led to a temporary decline in the efficiency of the Prague mint, slowing the standardization of the coinage at a time when the Habsburg state required massive funding for its defense against the Ottoman advance. The lack of Jewish bullion brokers meant that the king had to procure precious metals from high-interest German banking houses in Augsburg, significantly increasing the crown's overall debt burden. The market stagnation of 1542 was further exacerbated by the dead capital, trapped within the sequestered real estate of the Jewish quarter. While many houses had been seized by Christian owners, these properties often remained unoccupied or underutilized because the new owners lacked the commercial expertise to manage the specialized workshops and warehouses they had inherited. This led to a physical decay of the district's infrastructure and a decline in the property tax base of the Old Town. By the end of the year, the initial municipal triumph over the Jewish competitors had been replaced by a realization of the high cost of exclusion. The economic vacuum left by the expulsion proved to be a structural impediment to the recovery of Prague following the Great Fire, demonstrating that the Jewish community's role in the Bohemian economy was not merely incidental but foundational to the city's status as a Central European commercial hub. This period of financial contraction served as the first practical indication that the total removal of the chamber servants would result in long-term fiscal damage to the very state and municipal institutions that had demanded their banishment. The migration of the Prague exiles into the rural hinterlands of Bohemia was governed by the primitive state of the 16th century road network and the onset of exceptionally harsh climatological conditions associated with the early phases of the Little Ice Age. As the caravans exited the relative security of the Vltava Valley, they transitioned from the paved thoroughfares of the capital to the unpaved Landstraßen, which the late autumn rains had transformed into deep quagmires of mud and silt. The logistical burden of moving multi-generational families was compounded by the strict limitations on transport capacity. Royal ordinances mandated that each wagon could not exceed a specific weight, forcing the refugees to abandon even essential provisions to make room for the elderly and the infirm. This created a state of chronic malnutrition among the marchers, as the caravans were prohibited from stopping in the royal towns along the route and were forced to bivouac in the open Bohemian forests, where the lack of adequate shelter led to a rapid increase in respiratory ailments and exposure-related mortality. The security of the exiles was fundamentally compromised by the partiality of the king's peace, which technically guaranteed safe passage but proved unenforceable in the densely forested regions of the Sudets and the Bohemian forest. The removal of the chamber servant status meant that the refugees were viewed as extraneous elements by the rural peasantry and the localized robber barons, or Raubritter, who operated with impunity in the administrative vacuum created by the Great Fire. Historical records from the land courts indicate a surge in reported highway spoliations during November and December of 1541, as bandits targeted the caravans for the portable wealth, such as silver coins and jewelry, that had been concealed within the linings of coats or the double bottoms of wagons. Because the exiles lacked the legal standing to testify against Christian assailants, these crimes remained largely unpunished, further incentivizing the opportunistic plundering of the refugee columns by local militias. The logistical difficulties were intensified by the Leibzoll, or body tax, which was levied at every feudal border and river crossing, systematically stripping the families of their remaining liquid capital. At the Elbe and Oder river crossings, the caravans were frequently delayed for days, as customs officers conducted intrusive inspections of assets, ostensibly to search for smuggled bullion, but often serving as a pretext for the extrajudicial seizure of horses and draft animals. The breakdown of wagon axles and the loss of livestock became existential threats, as the exiles were forbidden from entering local villages to seek the services of blacksmiths or to purchase forage. This forced many families to continue their journey on foot through the snow-covered mountain passes, where the caloric requirements of the march far exceeded the dwindling rations of dried grain and legumes they were permitted to carry. The social structure of the caravans remained centered on the companionship of the road, where the remaining communal elders managed the distribution of resources and the defense of the encampments. However, the physical toll of the journey decimated the most vulnerable demographics. Contemporary burial registries in the border towns of Silesia and Upper Lusatia record a disproportionate number of unnamed Bohemian exiles interred in paupers' graves during the winter of 1542. By the time the survivors reached the checkpoints of the Polish or Moravian borders, the community was in a state of profound physical and psychological exhaustion. This period of migration represented a total transition from urban stability to nomadic precariousness, as the exiles were forced to navigate a landscape that was both geographically and legally hostile. The hardships of the road thus served as the final filter of the expulsion process, ensuring that only those with significant physical resilience or remaining hidden assets would survive to reach the relative sanctuary of the eastern and southern diasporas. The arrival of the Prague exiles in the Kingdom of Poland during the winter of 1541 and 1542 coincided with the mature period of the Jagiellonian Renaissance, overseen by King Sigismund I, also known as Sigismund the Old. Unlike the exclusionary policies enacted by the Habsburg administration in Bohemia, the Polish crown maintained a long-standing tradition of Jagiellonian pluralism, predicated on the economic and demographic necessity of repopulating the eastern frontiers. Sigismund I had recently confirmed the General Charter of Jewish Liberties in 1532, which reinforced the 13th century Statutes of Kalisz and granted the Jewish population significant autonomy in judicial, religious, and commercial affairs. This legal framework positioned Poland as a demographic sanctuary, where the Jewish community functioned as an indispensable urban estate that bridged the gap between the landed Polish nobility and the peasantry. The primary destination for the Bohemian refugees was Kazimierz, the autonomous Jewish city adjacent to the capital of Krakow, which had already established itself as a primary center of Ashkenazi culture. The institutional structure of Kazimierz, governed by its own kahal or communal council, facilitated the rapid integration of the Prague exiles by granting them immediate access to the local guild-exempt markets. The exiles brought with them a high degree of technical expertise in metallurgy, silk weaving, and advanced bookkeeping, which Sigismund I encouraged as a means of modernizing the Polish urban economy. Historical tax records from 1542 indicate a significant increase in the number of Prague-born artisans registered in the Krakow subdistricts, particularly within the printing and goldsmithing sectors. The presence of these skilled laborers allowed the Krakow Hebrew printing presses to expand their production, adopting the refined Prague style of typography that would eventually define the aesthetic of Jewish books across Eastern Europe. Lublin, situated at the crossroads of the trade routes connecting the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, emerged as the secondary node of absorption, rapidly evolving into the Jerusalem of the East. The Lublin fairs, which operated under royal protection, provided the Prague financiers with a platform to rebuild their international credit networks, utilizing their remaining ties to the Ottoman territories to facilitate the transit trade of Oriental luxury goods. In 1541, Sigismund I granted the Lublin Jewish community the right to establish a permanent yeshiva or rabbinical academy, which became a focal point for the displaced scholars of the Vltava Valley. This intellectual transfer ensured that the legal and philosophical traditions of the Prague ghetto were preserved and synthesized with the burgeoning Polish Jewish scholarship, eventually leading to the formation of the Council of Four Lands, the supreme organ of Jewish self-government in Poland. The welcoming policy of the Polish crown was a strategic maneuver to centralize royal power against the autonomous tendencies of the municipal city councils. The absorption of the Prague exiles represented a massive transfer of human capital from the Habsburg territories to the Vistula Basin, shifting the center of gravity of Ashkenazi life toward the east for the next 3 centuries. This period of resettlement was characterized by a rapid demographic expansion in the Polish royal towns, where the expertise of the Bohemian refugees contributed to the development of a resilient and economically sophisticated diaspora that would maintain its distinct cultural identity while serving as a vital pillar of the Polish-Lithuanian state. Following the expiration of the St. Martin's Day deadline in 1541, the physical landscape of the Prague Jewish quarter entered a period of unprecedented auditory and social stasis. The district, which for centuries had functioned as a high-density sensory environment defined by the convergence of liturgical recitation and mercantile exchange, was transformed into an administrative void under the oversight of the royal burgrave's watchmen. By the spring of 1542, the administrative finality of the expulsion decree had resulted in a measurable degradation of the royal treasury's liquidity. Coinciding with the escalation of the Little War in Hungary, Ferdinand I, whose initial concession to the expulsion was a calculated maneuver to secure parliamentary subsidies, found that the removal of Jewish capital had paralyzed the very credit markets he relied upon to pay the mercenary garrisons at Komarno and Győr. The 1542 sessions of the Imperial Diet at Nuremberg further highlighted this dependency, as the Habsburg administration struggled to negotiate loans with South German banking houses that lacked the localized knowledge and flexible terms previously provided by the Prague-based Jewish factors. The economic vacuum within the Bohemian capital led to a rapid re-evaluation of the exclusionary model by the royal chancery. While the Christian guilds of the Old Town had successfully occupied the physical space of the ghetto, they proved institutionally incapable of replicating the international transit trade or the complex commodity exchange systems that had linked Prague to the Mediterranean and Baltic markets. This failure resulted in a localized trade deficit that threatened the solvency of the royal mint and reduced the overall yield of the extraordinary taxes approved by the Diet. Consequently, as early as late 1542, the seeds of return were sown through the issuance of the first Schutzbrief, or individual safe conduct letters, granted by the monarch to specific Jewish families whose metallurgical or financial expertise was deemed indispensable to the defense of the realm. These initial permits represented a shift from the medieval general privilege toward an early modern system of exceptional residency, where the right of return was predicated on direct service to the crown rather than corporate communal rights. This administrative flexibility allowed Ferdinand I to bypass the anti-Jewish statutes of the Bohemian Diet by framing these returnees as royal court factors rather than permanent urban residents. The nobility, despite their earlier support for the expulsion, also began to signal a willingness to tolerate a limited Jewish presence, as the total lack of competitive credit had inflated the interest rates offered by other lenders to unsustainable levels. By the end of the year, the Prague question had evolved from a matter of total removal to a debate over the precise terms of a limited, fiscally motivated restoration.